This is Alan Reed. I was inspired to create a complete and unbiased presentation that highlights the miracles of the Shroud of Turin. The presentation is professionally narrated by Patricia M. Smith.
These images may be familiar to you. They are the positive and negative images from the Shroud of Turin, believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. The upper is the shroud positive image, lower is negative image, which is what we see visually. The presentation is titled The Shroud of Turin, a Believer's Presentation. The copyright is intended to protect new illustrations. After extensive research, this believer wants to share what he's learned. The questions: authentic or fraudulent? Miraculous or ordinary? What are the facts, what is learned, and what is the meaning? My presentation will start answering the questions and explaining the 5 miracles on the shroud in a countdown sequence. The crucifixion and resurrection sequence is re-illustrated using the shroud, the Bible, Jewish entombment laws, and the geography of Jerusalem. I will provide scientific and artistic proof that the shroud is authentic. Does it document he lived, he died, he rose? What is the meaning? On the day of Christ's crucifixion, these 2 cloths began as simple white cloths. The shroud is 2 by 8 cubits in size using the then current measurement system. Following Jewish tradition, when Jesus died, the face cloth was immediately wrapped over his head. This cloth exists today as the Sudarium of Oviedo because it is kept in a cathedral in Oviedo, Spain. The word Sudarium is roughly defined as a cloth to wipe your face or a handkerchief. Today, the shroud displays images of the man. Best to think of the shroud as a photograph, the way you keep pictures of your loved ones. Both cloths are described in this presentation. In 1975, I was able to make the trip to Israel. We arrived in Jerusalem just after it had turned dark. Our tour guide said that he had been in Israel 6 months ago, so he knew the best place to get a sandwich in the old city of Jerusalem. It was supper time, so a small group of people and I set out walking. We had walked several blocks when we reached an area where there was only a concrete street to our right. We were on a sidewalk, and there was about a 5-foot-high concrete wall to our left. Our tour group leader was several steps ahead of me when he waved his left arm above the concrete wall and announced that the garden tomb was right here. I was very excited. I stopped to try to look over the wall. There was a street light ahead of us to the right, but the area I tried to see was completely dark. I asked, "When do we get to see it?" I will always remember what he said. The way we have the trip set up is this. Tomorrow we will see the tomb of Christ at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The next day we will see the garden tomb here. I said something. Maybe I asked him a question. But he continued, "It is like this. Catholics go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Protestants go to the garden tomb. Have you ever wanted to smack your forehead with your hand?" I was shocked to learn, just after arriving in Jerusalem, that Christ had 2 tombs. Try to view this picture as if returning to 33 A.D. You'd be seeing a vineyard and a grove of trees. Near the garden tomb is an ancient wine press and a large cistern. These were known to have been there even before Christ, as the road on the right coming from Damascus. The Damascus gate through the wall into the old city of Jerusalem is in the same place as it was in 33 A.D., as well as the road between the city wall and the garden tomb area. Here are 2 maps of the old city of Jerusalem. On the map to the left, the gray area is the size of the city in 33 A.D. In 41 A.D., Jerusalem began to expand greatly, with walls being built to include a much larger area. Possibly there was an influx of Christians immediately after Christ's resurrection. Of course, in 70 A.D., the Romans destroyed the city. Today, the old city is shown by the map on the right. Modern Jerusalem is much larger and encompasses the old city, which is still surrounded by huge walls. Added to the map are estimated dimensions marked 9/10, 6/10, and 1/2 miles. You can only enter the old city by walking through its outer gates. Inside the city, the streets are very narrow and you must walk everywhere. The garden tomb and Golgotha are north, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is west of the city wall. While the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is within city walls today, Note that in 33 AD, the site was outside the walls of the city. Consider two more possibilities: that the actual tomb may have been destroyed at some point in history, or the tomb may still be undiscovered. Another opinion is that both tombs are the dreaded tourist traps. But after careful thought, there is a solution. Be delighted that there are two tombs. There are two places to worship. Both tombs are historic, with God directing history His way. Thus, neither is a tourist trap. It hits both segments of the market: upscale church, expensive restaurant, and common garden tomb, garden salad. Based on the evidence, the garden tomb area is used in this presentation. Here again is the panorama of the garden tomb area. The blue triangle on the map of the old city wall shows the panorama location. The tomb is about 500 feet from the skull feature. Skull Hill is about 700 feet from the Damascus Gate. There are two stunning pieces of information. God gave Jerusalem a unique chemistry of limestone. Tiny pieces of limestone found on the shroud match Jerusalem limestone. There are also tiny particles of dirt on the shroud. These particles match dirt found specifically at the Damascus Gate. The garden tomb area seems to match the biblical description. The Bible states that both the crucifixion site and tomb are in a garden. The garden is actually a large area including a vineyard, a winepress, and a cistern. There is the ability to collect extra rainwater from the hill to fill the cistern. It is on a south-facing slope, ideal for growing. It's a considerable distance, 500 feet between crucifixion site and tomb. The garden tomb. The small opening is a window to the tomb. The entrance scene actually opens to the antechamber or weeping chamber. The concrete blocks are a modern repair to the wall of the tomb. The channel in front of the tomb acts as a guide for the great stone that covered the entrance. The tomb is actually on the right side. The antechamber is where one would mourn the deceased in the tomb, hence the nickname Weeping Chamber. The enclosure actually combines the function of funeral home and tomb. Looking down the channel in front of the tomb, the great stone would have been contained here. The sign shows a diagram of the tomb. This is the tomb diagram showing the two rooms. The ceiling is dome-like, however, feeling like an igloo. The tomb is redrawn to the 1975 appearance with only one small entrance from the antechamber to the tomb. The tomb is only the room on the right. The repair allows visitors to look from the antechamber into the tomb more clearly. So how does the tomb match the Bible? The tomb diagram places the women and the angel. The angels guard the tomb on the right. First, John enters the antechamber and looks into the tomb. Peter then enters the tomb directly. Then John follows Peter. Mary Magdalene looks into the tomb and sees and talks to angels. Then Christ stands outside the tomb. Mary perceives that someone is standing outside because the room has darkened by shade. She thinks it is the gardener, but then Christ identifies himself. Skull Hill. This cliff is on the edge of the garden area, about 300 feet from the city wall. The skull feature, Golgotha, is quite sizable when compared to trees and the fence. The word Golgotha translates into Latin as Calvaros, then from Latin to English as Calvary. Christians use the word Calvary often in songs and sermons and names of churches. This skull feature could be considered Calvary, but there is no need to change anything about the way the word is used. Perhaps the place of the skull could really be interpreted as the place where the skull can be viewed. So where is the great stone that sealed the entrance to the tomb? Believe it or not, in 2007, an English preacher named Simon Brown was looking at the internet when he saw this picture and immediately began to wonder if this was the great stone that was placed in front of the garden tomb. It took him until 2011 before he could arrange to make the trip to Jordan and Israel. Measurements of the stone for diameter and width show that the stone was an excellent fit in the channel at the garden tomb entrance. Samples of the limestone were taken from the stone and from the garden tomb. The chemistry of the limestone matched perfectly. The stone sits on top of Mount Nebo, where Moses could see the Promised Land. The story is that the stone was used as a door to a Byzantine monastery. The Byzantines would have been here between the years 500 and 1000. The Byzantines must have known about the garden tomb, as crosses identified as Byzantine were found drawn inside the tomb. The man is pointing at an iron rod stuck in the rock near the entrance of the garden tomb. The bar is in the center of the picture detail. The Romans would make a seal by chiseling a hole in the rock, then melt lead and pour the lead into the hole. An iron bar would then be inserted into the hole, which would be held securely in place when the lead hardened. The guide at the garden tomb does not know if this bar is authentic to the Romans or if it was added later. It is in the correct location to block the stone from moving away from the tomb entrance. If you could have been there Saturday afternoon, April 4th, 33 AD, one could possibly have seen the garden tomb sealed. Estimate the garden tomb and skull area at 95% confidence rating for authenticity. Now focus on what happened. The crucifixion sequence will be re-illustrated using the Shroud, the Bible, Jewish entombment laws, and the skull of Skull Hill. In addition to a man's shape, the Shroud recorded images of objects and flowers. The entombment laws of the time required that blood-stained objects be placed with the deceased. Objects used in the crucifixion sequence will be noted. This is Christ walking into the Garden of Gethsemane. When a Jewish man goes to pray, he wears a phylactery on his forehead and his left arm. The forehead phylactery is placed at the top of his forehead and has two straps which hang down to near his waist. The left arm phylactery has a lengthy strap that winds all the way down his arm to his hand. Picture of the central part of a 1st century forehead phylactery as found by archaeologists. The dimensions of this piece are only 1/2 by 3/4 inches. There are 4 scripture compartments which still have scriptures attached. Begin crucifixion sequence. Christ is seized in Gethsemane, punched and beaten. He is taken to be scourged. Model of a Roman flagellum, about 2 feet total length. The flagellum has pairs of sharpened pieces of metal tied to the end of the cords. The metal is sharpened to tear flesh. This is beginning the scourging stroke. Christ would have been tied in this manner in order to allow the flagellum to hit his shoulders, chest, back, buttocks, and the front and back of both of his legs. This is the finishing stroke. Wounds from the scourging can often be found in pairs due to the adjacent pieces of metal tearing his flesh. The Romans cut open the phylacteries and desecrated them. They created a crown of thorns and placed it on his head. They mocked him and hit him with sticks. This is Gundelia tourneforti. It is like a weed that has thorns. This was used to make the crown of thorns. There is abundant pollen from this plant found on the Shroud. This is significant because this plant only appears during March and April, identifying the season. The Romans hit Christ with sticks. This would get the thorns to pierce his scalp. There may have been another piece to the crown of thorns, which could also have included thorns. This piece would have held the pieces of the crown together. Christ is presented to the crowd by Pilate. A flower may have been placed in the crown of thorns, which looks more like 1/2 of a head of lettuce. Both phylacteries are desecrated. The forehead phylactery is cut in half and left in the center of the forehead, just above eye level. The left arm phylactery is on the outside of his elbow, and several straps have been cut. His eyes are blackened, his cheeks and nose are swollen from beatings, and blood is all around his face. The jacket is made by the Roman military. Likely the straps from the forehead phylactery were used to tie an amulet of Roman Emperor Tiberius Caesar to hang in front of his chest. When you are a bully, you can laugh at your victim. However, Pilate is not interested in hurting Christ any more than what has already been done to him. Indeed, he wishes to free him. A title is written on wood and nailed to the cross. A rope is tied around his waist, and he is led out to be crucified. It is thought that the Romans would tie a rope around the waist of their victim and the other end of the rope around the waist of the soldier to prevent the victim from escaping. This is what is meant by the term let out. On the shroud, the man has abrasions on his shoulders consistent with carrying something rough and heavy. The man also has skinned knees consistent with falling heavily on his knees. This is the most efficient way to perform a crucifixion. The rope would be used to lash the hands and feet tight, while the nails are being driven in the hands and feet. The rope then would be used to tie the cross to a tree. The ancients would never have dug a post hole, especially not in Jerusalem where the earth is rocky. The crucifixion looking south towards Jerusalem. The wall of the city of Jerusalem is about 300 feet away, as seen in the background. The Damascus gate is on the wall, but is well to the right of this view and not in sight. A walking path runs in front of the two thieves, but behind the tree that Christ is tied upon. A line from one thief to the other thief would be 10 to 12 feet behind Christ. The path switches back to the side and front of Christ. When the Romans practiced crucifixion, a victim could be hung on a capital T as it left, a small t as for Christ, or as an X as shown on the right. In the Greek language, the word for Christ is spelled with an X as the first letter and an I for the second letter. So the ancient Greeks created a symbol for Christianity of an X and an I together. Even today, in some older churches, the XI symbol can still be found. The crucifixion looking north at the skull. The path is more clearly seen behind the tree that Christ is tied to. The men being crucified are facing the skull on the side of the cliff. This location was perfect for the Romans. There are trees in the garden and the skull feature. As the crucifixion victims are suffering towards death, the Romans could taunt their victims by pointing to the skull. Roman soldiers used dice to gamble for Christ's coat. With a sponge on a stick, Christ is offered a drink. Shortly afterwards, he gives up his life. The crown of thorns would have been removed, and the smaller cloth, the cedarium, is wrapped around his head by the disciples who were present and watching. The cloth was applied at death to keep any blood and body fluids with Christ. This is vital in Jewish belief that blood is life and must be retained by the deceased. The Jews request Pilate to finish the crucifixion, so he dispatches soldiers. Joseph of Arimathea receives permission from Pilate to take possession of Christ's body. He then purchases supplies to accomplish the entombment, including myrrh, aloes, a tray, and whisk brooms. He purchases the shroud and has a strip cut from the entire length. They carry all items to the crucifixion site and tomb. The Roman soldiers reach the crucifixion site and break the legs of both thieves. They arrive at the right-hand side of Christ and recognize that he is already dead because of the cloth around his head. In this view, the Damascus gate is straight ahead behind the trees. The Roman soldiers break the legs of the thief in this view, then proceed to the thief on the left, not shown in this view, to break his legs. The path switches back, and they arrive at the right side of Christ. They cannot see Christ until they reach his side. In this arrangement, Christ cannot be seen from the point of view of both thieves. The soldiers become suspicious. The disciples are still there. The two thieves were still alive. Maybe his disciples are trying to steal him away, still alive. They determine to spear him to ensure his death. On the Turin shroud, the man has a stabbing wound to the right side of his chest. There is fluid and blood from this wound, exactly as described in the Bible. The forensic doctors who have studied the crucifixion can confirm that after Christ has died and had remained hanging for an hour, his lungs and chest cavity would have filled with fluid. So the flow of fluid and blood from this wound is actually what they would expect. This wound was inflicted while still hanging vertically, seen due to the fluid flow. Later, Joseph and others arrive at the crucifixion site and at the tomb carrying the various entombment supplies. They take possession of the body of Christ and all of the items used. Also, when there is any artwork of the crucifixion, note that the spear wound is always shown on the right side of Christ's chest. This detail is derived from the shroud, as artists understood the shroud's negative image. Every day, sacrifices were performed at the temple in Jerusalem at 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. Christ is lifted onto the cross at 9 a.m., died 3 p.m., thus matching the daily temple sacrifices. Christ was carried from the crucifixion site to the tomb. The simplest way to move him would be to remain nailed to the cross until reaching the tomb. The Bible says that the women who were disciples had to follow him being carried so that they could find the tomb. Actually, there would have been a sizable number of people following, including disciples, Romans, and Jews. All of the objects that had been bloodied are brought to the tomb, including a hammer, the spear, and the sponge on a stick. The nails are removed using pliers. Therefore, pliers are added to the list of bloody objects. The whisk brooms and tray used for cleanup will be placed with Christ. All other bloody objects are placed in the shroud with Christ. The sudarium, the cloth around his head, is removed and set aside. Flowers are placed on and around Christ for the purpose of mourning him. Study of the sudarium states that someone placed their left hand on the sudarium during this transport. There is a legend that a cloth was used underneath Christ while being crucified and carried. This would be consistent with Jewish laws. Christ was carried about 500 feet, thus requiring 5 to 10 minutes. All bloodied objects must be placed within the shroud: two flagellum, crown of thorns, spear, hammer, dice, sponge on a stick, rope, the title, whisk brooms, tray with spoon, and pliers. The illustrations are not authentic to any tomb. Reported practices of the time tell us this scene would be typical, where the deceased would be placed on a waist-high bench. Myrrh and aloes have been spread under and inside the shroud. The shroud now covers Christ. The strip of cloth that had been trimmed from the length of the shroud is used as a wrap to tighten the shroud around the body. It is thought that writing in ink has been transferred to the outside of the shroud. Apparently, these writings identify Jesus. Note the face cloth is set to the side. The entombment is complete when Joseph of Arimathea rolls the stone to cover the entrance. From death to resurrection is about 36 hours. Christ tells the disciples beforehand what will happen. He asks, "Aren't there 12 hours in a day?" It can also be expressed that part of Friday, all of Saturday, and part of Sunday constitute the 3 days. A human body will begin to decompose starting 40 hours after death. The resurrection after 36 hours eliminates this possibility. Had the body begun to decompose, there would be distinctive stains on the shroud that would identify that this process had begun. Prophecy in the Bible also tells how God's Holy One will not see decay. When Peter and John come into the tomb, this is what they see. There are 3 differences when Peter and John return to the tomb. One of the differences is described. Also, the shroud is empty and has changed color. Starting the miracle countdown. Miracle 5 is the image. The shroud is history's first photograph. The shroud is not truly a photograph. The similarities are that by light and radiation, the image was formed on a flat surface, a cloth, and there is a positive and a negative image. With human eyesight, the negative image is seen. There is an interface line that cannot be defined that separates the 2 sides of the man such that front and back images are formed. The radiation included information to create the images. The distance from the body to the cloth is critical to image formation. Almost nothing of the sides of the man are found. The sequence began at the top and finished about as shown at the bottom. The middle is uncertain. The shroud acted as if it had straightened out and became a photographic plate, receiving blood and images up and down. And there is no gravity. The body is weightless. There is no distortion from the cloth touching the body or the body touching the floor. This assessment was made by scientist Isabelle Pizek. Each thread of the shroud consists of between 75 to 125 fibrils. The image exists only on the topmost fibrils. 1 or 2 deep have been yellowed. There are more yellowed fibrils where the image is darker. The fibrils are yellowed around the entire circumference of the fibril. The yellowing is from chemical changes to the carbon atoms. The incredible amount of information used to create the image carefully chose which fibrils to change. This slide depicts the incredibly tiny dimensions of a fibril and the image. Scientists use the terminology conjugated double-bonded carbon to describe the chemical change. More simply, some of the electrons now orbit around more than one carbon atom nucleus. The most astonishing feature of the image is that if you move to within 4 feet of the shroud, the image disappears. Also, more than about 12 to 14 feet from the shroud, the image also disappears. Therefore, the zone where the image is visible is at most about 10 feet wide. Depending on one's position in distance and angle to the shroud, changing your position in the viewing zone will cause parts of the image to appear and disappear. Miracle 4. The blood on the shroud is pristine. The blood gives a picture of the wounds. The blood is still red. There is a smooth separation of the man from the shroud, such that the blood shows that the man vanished from within the shroud, not from being unwrapped. The blood collection on the linen preceded the image's formation. A simple test. Drawing blood at a physical exam and photographing the blood freshly drawn and the same blood 36 hours later, about the length of time when the resurrection occurred. The blood has darkened. This is how blood on the shroud would have appeared at the time of the resurrection. The blood on the shroud appears red and fresh. The photo at the upper right is a close-up of the blood on the shroud. When the shroud is photographed, it seems almost impossible to match the actual red color that a person would see in Turin. The photo at the lower right comes close to showing the actual red color. The most striking feature of the blood is that it is still red. Above, in the typical shroud photograph, the red is strangely obscured. Below, the photo has been enhanced, showing more accurately what the viewer would see in Turin. Miracle 3. A long list of objects bloodied in the crucifixion sequence were placed around Christ within the shroud. There are also items used for cleanup, items worn by the man, and burial aids. Not all of these can be regarded as proven. Flowers were added for mourning, and small solid objects became caught in the cloth. History of images. It was known for a long time that images of objects and flowers existed on the shroud. When the extensive study of the shroud came in 1978, images of objects and flowers could not be found. In 1980, a scientist began to look into this question. He found that only photographs of the shroud taken in 1931 showed faint and fragmentary images of objects and flowers. Today, only 10% of the images that were originally on the shroud remain. It is about 20% of the man, nothing of objects and flowers. All of the images have faded due to age, handling, damaged by water stains, and destroyed by fire. From 1931 to 1978 added 47 years, 2.5%. to the age of the image. During World War II, the shroud was taken to the monastery of Monteverne, which is near Naples, a long trip. The image coating on the fibrils may have been affected as vibrations and bumps in transit could have loosened the coatings. An example of Miracle 3. Here is a chrysanthemum flower imaged on the shroud. In this 1931 photograph, the flower is faintly seen between the example flowers. This flower seemed to be in the crown of thorns. This is a positive image. There may be an outline of parts of the phylactery showing and a V-shaped notch, but identification is unproven. Perhaps the Jews should have realized Jesus was trying to indicate that the faith was being changed. Existence of the phylactery is 90% proven. What is on his eyes? The first clue was three-dimensional analysis indicating round, flat discs laying on the eyelids. An ancient practice was to place coins on the eyelids of the deceased. Identifying letters leads to the identification of Roman coins dated about 30 A.D. This exhibit is at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. The actual coin is on the left. The photo at right is enlarged. This coin is a die mate of the coin identified on the eyelid. Christ got 2 for the price of 1, as the man looks awake and alive. Also, his shroud has been time dated. The existence of these coins is 100% proven. Can Christ be identified? A computer with vision was used to detect patterns and produced these results. The theory is that words were written in ink on papyrus, and the papyrus was pressed onto the shroud around his face. If you could see through the image side of the shroud, this is what you would see if it were enhanced. Not all the letters are identified, but to death is in Latin and Nazarene is in Greek. HSOY could be part of Jesus. IHSOYS is Jesus in Greek, rated at 55% authentic. A scientist using computer dimensional analysis has stated that he has found a necklace with letters on it just below the beard of the man of the shroud. It is oval-sized, about 2 by 4.25 inches. Artwork of Christ may show some of the necklace as the top of his garments and various shadings on his neck. The necklace has 3 Hebrew letters on it, meaning sheep, small cattle, and goats. Another meaning is to make a sign with a sheep. The only use of this word in the Bible is Exodus 12:21, when the Israelites are instructed to take the blood of the Passover lamb and brush it on the lintel and doorposts of the entrance to the house, so that the death angel will pass over your house and ensure your safety. The suggestion is that Jesus is identifying himself as the Passover lamb, rated at 55% authentic. Artists often interpreted the necklace as the top lines of his garments. In images of Christ, these 2 lines are often seen, also unusual shading on his neck. These 2 artworks show that the artist actually seems to have seen the necklace. This is artistic evidence that supports the necklace theory. There are 7 things we know with 100% certainty about the man of the shroud: crucified, scourged, origination in Jerusalem, occurred in March-April, coins on eyelids dated 30 AD, stabbed in the side after his death, wounds on his head from a thorny plant. Probability is calculated by multiplying together the odds of each separate event. Even just from these 7 features, the probability reaches an astronomical number that this is Christ. But the image and blood on the shroud are miraculous. Without these, there is no shroud. Christ is the only man we know of who was reported to be a miracle worker. The shroud is from Christ without question. So if the shroud is authentic, then where has it been since the crucifixion? This map shows the most important places where the shroud has been. Jerusalem in 33 AD, then to Edessa, now Sanliurfa, 944. Galatia is in central Turkey. Constantinople, now Istanbul, 944 to 1204. There is a theory that the shroud was in Athens after leaving Constantinople. Lyrae, 1355. St. Hippolyte, 1420 to 1453. Then mostly Chambéry and Turin until 1578. It has been in Turin since 1578, except for Montevergine during World War II. For many years of history, only legends about the shroud can be found. Even worse, there are many years where the shroud is missing. Here is a fascinating legend. Abgar, king of a city known as Edessa, southeast Turkey, is ill. He hears about Christ and sends a letter to Christ appealing to him to come to Edessa and heal him. From what he hears, Abgar writes that you are God, or the Son of God. Christ sends a letter back to him declining his invitation, but promises to send one of his disciples to heal him. After the resurrection, Thaddeus, one of the 12, takes the shroud to Edessa and Abgar is healed. After this, many people in Edessa become Christians. Another place in the Bible where the shroud may have been mentioned is in Galatians 3:1. Paul chastises the Galatians for losing faith, even after he mentions that the Galatians had seen vividly or graphically the sufferings of Christ. Galatia is in modern central Turkey. The shroud was in Edessa, which is in modern southeastern Turkey. So possibly Paul and the Galatians had traveled to Edessa. 2 early images of Christ. Maybe he appears scholarly on the right. One of the very few early images of Christ showing him bearded, clearly not authentic. Christ carrying a calf. St. Augustine is one of Christianity's greatest theologians. In the early 400s, he notes that designs of Christ are innumerable and that we don't know of his external appearance. Early images of Christ at the church in Ravenna, Italy. The church began to be built about the year 500. On the left is Christ treading on the beasts, standing on a lion and a snake. This is an enlargement of his face. Another artwork in the church is Christ on a celestial globe, his face unlike the other. These are dated to around the year 525. But then in the same church, look straight up at the ceiling, being 125 feet above, and you see this image, the man we are used to seeing. This was done in 548. In one place, 3 various images of Jesus, 2 non-authentic, the other authentic, only 23 years apart. This image of Christ was done in 555 AD. This famous image of Christ is matched closely to the shroud. From this point on, all serious images of Christ are consistent. Byzantine coins of Christ minted in 692 AD. Images of Christ on the coins very closely match the shroud image. In the Middle Ages, images of Christ become very consistent. In the 1930s, Paul Vignon, a French scientist, made a facial analysis of Christ using the shroud and ancient artwork. He listed 15 distinctive features. These are the 9 most easily seen. Note 2 strands of hair at the top of the forehead. In reference to the phylactery, he found a transverse line across the forehead, a U-shaped square, and a V-shaped notch above the nose. His right eyebrow is raised. Under his lip, the beard is thin, and he has a forked beard. Hair hangs lower on the left side, a line across the throat. Artists having bad days. Actually, although Jesus doesn't look very good, these are both very accurate comparing the facial analysis. The phylactery is blended into his forehead, blackened eyes and damaged nose. The damaged beard is evident. He was beaten and dead, so he actually did not look very good, and these artists well illustrated his torture. Compared to the previous slide, Jesus in white turtleneck, these artists looked past the strange markings on his face, cleaned him up, and didn't spend time trying to illustrate his neck. Artwork changes dramatically starting in 548 and 555. So what happened? Abgar was healed in 33 AD. The city becomes Christian. The city has walls around it and a river on the east side. The legend is that an arch was constructed above the gate at the western entrance of the city, the highest point of land in the city. The shroud was placed in an arch, such that as you entered the city, you could look up in the arch and see the face of Christ. About 50 AD, Abgar passes, and the first son of Abgar reigns. But he only reigns until about 57 AD when he passes. The next son of Abgar reigns, and the city started to change because this son of Abgar was not a Christian. In fact, he began to persecute Christians. The story is that one night some Christians came to the gate, chiseled a few bricks out of the arch, and moved the shroud further into the arch. Then they remortared the bricks in place. By morning, everything looked the same, except that the shroud had vanished. Perhaps these heroes ended up as martyrs because the secret of where the shroud had been hidden was lost. The shroud would remain locked up in that arch, not seeing the light of day or another person for the next 467 years. How incredible is that? There is a river on the east side of Edessa. There is a term, the 100-year floodplain. Maybe the term 100-year floodplain came from Edessa, because every 100 years or so the city would be devastated by a flood. The flood of 525 was said to have been a really bad one. By this time, the city was Christian again and was part of the Byzantine Empire. The emperor sent his national guard to Edessa to rebuild the city. They opened the western gate and found the shroud. This artwork was made to show the rediscovery of the shroud in 525. Shroud rediscovery using careful thought. As a result of the rediscovery of the shroud, artwork changes. Men will make many images of Jesus and gods. Many will be wrong or ridiculous without an image of Jesus. The shroud was protected from damage for a long time. The change of artwork actually helps prove the authenticity of the shroud. The time gap was a lost opportunity for evangelism. More careful thought. God sent Jesus, a man who creates life apart from himself. With his beard, a man's face and body cannot be confused as a woman. The photo of Christ places Christianity far beyond any leader or religion. His recognition will lead many to heaven. He is revealed. He wants us to know him. Why was the shroud not given more description in the Bible? Thaddeus dies in the 40s, so he didn't get to write a gospel or the story of Abgar. The shroud was lost before the Gospels were written. Edessa was a Christian city, so more focus by the disciples was given to Greece and Rome. The Sudarium left Jerusalem in the early 600s to be kept safe from invading Persians. It was taken to Alexandria, Egypt, then to Spain, arrived in Cartagena about 615, then to Seville, Toledo, and finally Oviedo about 710. Oviedo is very close to the sea. Pollen finds confirms the path across Africa and Spain. It is considered authentic by historians. This is the Sudarium. Like the shroud, it has been carefully studied by scientists. The left part was placed in back of the head and has bloodstains from the crown of thorns. The part on the right was directly on his face. Then the middle part was folded back over his face, so his face was covered by 2 layers of cloth. This is why these stains are like mirror images of each other. The position of the head can be understood by examining the stains. There are 6 parts fluid to 1 part blood. The scientists have performed experiments by constructing a head with a nose and a mouth, using a pump so that the fluid could be expelled through the nostrils and mouth. They believe the first stain occurred when the cloth was placed on his face. This first stain dries, then more than 1 hour later there is a second stain where the man is taken down, laying on the ground with the right side of the face down. The second stain dries. Then more than another hour passes when the third stain is created. This stain is considered to have occurred while the body of the man is being carried. Someone is using his left hand holding the cloth against his face during this movement. The time being carried is considered to be 5 to 10 minutes. This would be consistent with slowly carrying the man about 500 feet. There are several coincidences, pollen, blood type, matching stains, that place the Sudarium as a companion to the shroud. With 70 points of congruence, it is concluded that the shroud and the Sudarium were wrapped around the head of the same person. It is possible to see the Sudarium 3 days each year, Good Friday, also September 14th and 21st. The Byzantine emperor was so thankful to have the shroud in his possession that he declared a feast day. The feast day celebrates translation of the image not made by hands of our Lord Jesus Christ from Edessa to Constantinople in 944. This is the first historic mention of the shroud. The shroud has been on fire 2 times. The poker holes in 4 layers predate 1192. The major burn damage occurred in 1532 in Chambéry, France. The church burned down. The shroud was folded up in a container that had a window. The fire got so hot that it melted the lead around the window, causing the molten material to fall on the shroud. In 1535, a backing cloth was added. In 2002, there was a renovation, replacing the backing cloth and seamlessly filling the holes. Christ in a box. He is bleeding from the right side of his chest. But how did he get in a box? We have 4 clues. There are actually a number of pieces of artwork of Christ in a box. Then there is a series of fold lines that can be found on the shroud. Nail holes in the edge of the shroud indicate being nailed. Finally, there is a report of Robert de Clary, one of the Knights Templar, who was in Constantinople in 1203. Every Friday, the shroud raised itself upright. The scientists believe that when the shroud was raised from the box, it would have appeared like this. These crucifixion artworks are typical of the Orthodox Church. About 1050, the Christian Church splits with the Catholic Church centered in Rome, becoming the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church centered in Constantinople, becoming the Orthodox Church, with possession of the shroud. Located in the Mideast, the Knights Templars also adopted the Orthodox design. One common feature of the artwork is bleeding from the right side of his chest, as artists understood the negative image of the shroud. Other common features are a muscular upper chest line, a strangely shaped abdomen, and a waistcloth. The origin of the upper chest line and the abdomen feature are not understood. The abdomen feature does not match a water stain that appears on the chest of the man on the shroud. From the 1400s through the 1800s, the shroud was exhibited by priests and bishops holding the edge of the cloth. There are a number of illustrations of these exhibitions, but this is an exceptional illustration as there are no burn lines through the entire length of the shroud. Therefore, this illustration was made before the fire of 1532, giving a good look at the way the shroud appeared 500 years ago. We can see that the image of the man is far better than the image seen today. Also seen is the strangely shaped abdomen, the upper chest line, and the waistcloth. Compare the shroud illustration to the artwork. As the shroud was in Constantinople, the artwork and culture of the Orthodox Church became directed by the shroud. Today, these images of the waistcloth, abdomen, and upper chest line have completely faded and no longer can be seen. Scientists now examine the shroud and state, he is naked, but he wasn't. This is Jesus' skinny arms. The image on the shroud was made in a way that shows the surface features, but does not show the sides of the body, arms, or legs. The black lines on the shroud photo outline the top of his arms. Artists were very careful to create artwork that was accurate, thus they perceived that his arms were skinny and reflected that in their art. This is Jesus' long fingers. In these artworks, he is shown with strangely long fingers. This is highlighted by the enlargements. How did Jesus get long fingers? Projecting the shroud full size, the fingers measure 5 inches long. For comparison, typically a hand from the wrist to the end of the fingers may be 6.5 inches long. This illustration seems to show what could be the formation of the finger image. Light and radiation directed straight up. The shadow of the finger on the shroud stretched over the top of the hand can reach the distorted length. Even though flawed, this proves that a process made the shroud. An artist would never have drawn fingers like this. It is an intentional flaw. Driving a nail through the hand and wrist will hit nerves. Apparently, the nerve damage causes the fingers and thumb to flex. Therefore, the shroud is an image not made by hands. Review the study of shroud artwork. Artwork changes dramatically starting in 548. Paul Vignon's facial study reveals 15 unique features. There is the upper chest line, the abdomen feature, bleeding from the right side of the chest, and the waistcloth. There is long fingers and skinny arms, a total of 22 features providing an artistic proof of the shroud's authenticity to Christ. The shroud is stolen in 1204 from Constantinople, the capital city of the Byzantine Empire. Although the Byzantines are our allies fighting Islam for the Holy Land, a force from Venice unites with a group of Knights Templars, and they proceed to sack Constantinople, doing a large amount of looting and destruction. The Byzantine emperor is replaced. The next historic sighting of the shroud will be 151 years later, when it reappears in France in 1355. This is another huge gap in the history of the shroud. In 1898, the shroud is photographed for the first time. This is Segundo Pia, a lawyer whose hobby was photography, owner of the best camera available in 1898. Pia photographed the face of the shroud as at left. His actual photograph is at right. Pia recalled that he was so stunned that he nearly dropped the photographic plate. The positive image is a sensation. Skeptics cried fake. From this photo, scientists began to take interest in the shroud. There was speculation that the shroud image contained features indicating depth, but there was no technology at this time that could demonstrate this. The positive image shows a dark background, but blood shows as white. The negative image is what we see with red blood. The shroud reverses what the background and the blood images should be like. In 1978, the largest scientific examination of the shroud took place. This was called STURP, or Shroud of Turin Research Project. From this project, the idea was conceived to perform a carbon dating test on the shroud. In 1988, the carbon dating test was performed. From the results, these scientists from the Carbon-14 labs claimed the shroud was a forgery. They can write those dates if they like, but the exclamation mark is completely unprofessional and inappropriate. A carbon-14 test is never a definitive test, proving nothing. Reading Romans 1:22 may cause this photo to come to mind. There is a large cultural divide in our world where scientists and others who are atheists, and also from major media, who profit from programming that opposes Christian values. These people almost always will attempt to discredit the Shroud. How do we get carbon-14? Neutrons from outer space strike our atmosphere and hit nitrogen atoms. Carbon has 6 protons, electrons, and neutrons, and nitrogen has 7 protons, electrons, and neutrons. The neutron knocks a proton out of nitrogen and adds itself to the atom. Thus, the new atom has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. That's carbon-14. Then it gets into our food chain and into every living thing. The neutrons eventually leave the atom at a rate of half-life of 5,730 years. The carbon-14 test counts carbon-14 atoms versus carbon-12 atoms. Thus, the ratio provides an estimated age of the item being tested. The Shroud is linen, which had been living and thus potentially could be dated. However, the managers of the carbon-14 labs managed to usurp the normal testing procedure. Labs are supposed to be a testing service only. Knowledgeable scientists are supposed to collect samples and interpret results. The carbon-14 labs included men who were outspoken atheists. Had the scientists thought thoroughly about the carbon-14 testing, they should have realized that this was a terrible idea and would be highly unlikely to show anything about the age of the cloth. To have a scientific test, you need original material in pristine condition. The Shroud is completely contaminated. Radiation from a resurrection overrules everything else as a problem. Already known was that carbon in the image fibrils had been chemically changed. The cloth itself is said to feel soft and strong. It is in excellent condition for an ancient cloth. It may be that the entire cloth has been chemically altered. Fire and smoke are carbon-changing forms. The Shroud has been on fire itself on 2 occasions. The 1532 fire was devastating as the cloth was trapped in a wooden enclosure that undoubtedly filled with smoke. Experiments have shown that carbon-14 would have been added to the Shroud due to this fire. After the fire of 1532, a backing cloth was sewn onto the Shroud. The seamstresses of 1535 were so fine that they could perform invisible reweaving. The sample likely included threads from 1535 and 1694. The sample was included within or very close to an ancient water stain. People handling the Shroud leave moisture and DNA on the cloth. Wine and wax are other materials that have been spilled on the Shroud. Notice where the hands of Christ are in the photograph identified by the blue arrow in the center. The arrow on the left shows the location from where the sample was taken for testing. Only one sample was taken. For a cloth 3.5 feet wide by 14.5 feet long, there should be several samples from a variety of locations. Looking back to the illustration of the Shroud exhibition, clearly there is potential contamination from the hands of men that continued for centuries. This is the detail of the sample site. There are 3 test sites. O is for Oxford, England, Z is for Zurich, Switzerland, and A is for Arizona. The total length of the sample was 5 centimeters or about 2 inches. The test results actually showed a trend line from older, Oxford, to younger, Arizona. With a trend line in place showing a difference of 110 years within the 2-inch long sample, there becomes no scientific basis to assess the age of the material. The testing laboratories held on to this data for 29 years, until a Freedom of Information Act was filed in the UK. That this data was concealed shows the extent of the dishonesty of this group of scientists. There was already suspicion that this area of the Shroud had been repaired. It was recently revealed that the Shroud was repaired again in 1694 in this area after the king had given Shroud threads away as souvenirs. The thickness of the Shroud cloth is 345 microns. The Arizona lab sample measured 250 microns. The material vanillin is found by special photography in this Shroud corner. It is not found on the rest of the Shroud. Visible and spectrographic photography show considerable differences from the sample area to the rest of the Shroud. The Shroud is considered to be a 3-to-1 herringbone twill. These textile experts consider the shroud cloth to be consistent with other ancient cloths that have been found. This fabric design is very uncommon for either the Middle Ages or modern fabrics. Here are some other carbon-14 dating results. A live mollusk was dated 2,000 years old, and a live seal dated 1,300 years old. Sea life is now considered not usually suitable for carbon-14 testing. A Viking horn, thought to have been used about the year 500, was dated to 2008, 16 years beyond the test date and 1,508 years after its use. A fence post that was used in the 1800s was dated at 6,000 years old. Finally, the Bayeux Tapestry was created in 1385 and 1635. Its threads were dated 1425 and 1950. The example of this historic artifact was in an article included within a book about the shroud. This article was explaining that we should believe our carbon-14 dating results, and they had included several examples where the test result closely matched the known age. So what is the Bayeux Tapestry? The year was 1066, one of the most famous years in world history. William of Normandy invaded England, he won the Battle of Hastings, and became the King of England. To celebrate this great victory, a cloth about 20 inches high and about 200 feet long was filled with needlepoint depicting scenes of history from the 1060s and the Battle of Hastings as imagined by the artists. Thus, the tapestry was made in the 1070s. In the article, it was suggested that a passing result would be post-11th century. In 2015, this new testing method was developed by Italian scientists. They obtained threads from the shroud and other threads from linen cloths where the age was known. With individual fibrils, they studied the reflection from infrared light and from laser light. The third test was tensile strength. The conclusion is that the shroud dates to 33 BC plus or minus 250 years. In 2019, a test for wide-angle X-ray scattering was developed. The conclusion is that the shroud is similar to a first-century linen found in Israel. What color is the shroud? When I went to Turin, I took the photo seen in the lower left. Later, I found that my partner and I had not even seen the same thing when we were in the viewing area close to the shroud. At a store, we selected cloths. Shown is the photo of two opinions. After leaving the viewing area, we re-entered the back of the church and could see the shroud from a distance of over 100 feet. The shroud was orange, similar to the photo top left. Of course, the image is not visible at this distance. At the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., I took the photo on the lower right. It is the same photo of the shroud just above it, but the lighting at the museum was brighter. The other 5 photographs are parts of the shroud that can be found on the internet. You see a variety of colors and shades here. However, I cannot find a photograph that is like the yellow gold cloth. This is one of the most mysterious features of the shroud. So, I have been to Turin and I have seen the shroud, but I can't tell you what color the shroud is. Miracle 2. A scientist experimented by projecting positive and negative images together and found that enhanced images can be found. Even more stunning, shifting one image a very slight distance vertically can reveal skeletal features. The picture on the left is taken by projecting the positive and negative images together and then taking a photograph. When the two images are slightly offset vertically, the X-ray images can be obtained. On the skull image, it is possible to see perfectly aligned teeth. This method has also been able to reveal X-ray images of bones of the hands, wrist, fingers, some backbones, and some of the bones in the feet. Miracle 1. The Man in Dimensions. The shroud image is actually compatible with three-dimensional computer graphics. From the shroud, it is possible to recreate three-dimensional features of the man. Ray Downing and Dr. Soons have been the leaders of developing this technology. Images on flat surfaces will not normally allow development of three-dimensional features. This picture was taken in 1976 by Dr. John Jackson. This is the first proof that a 3D image existed in the shroud. Development of the entire man in dimensions has taken many years. The positive image of the shroud is shown above the carving to show the correspondence between the image and the carving. This shows the size of the 3D carving by comparing it to these three men. Features of blood have been added to his side and feet. To become a shroud maker the way this man produced the shroud, you will have to be a man that knows everything that is going to happen. Another fascinating discovery is found by comparing negative images. On the left, the subject is laying down with the light exposing his entire face. Therefore, the negative image shows almost all of his face as dark, and note that his hair scatters on top of the pillow. On the right, the subject is standing up, and it is compared closely to the negative image of the shroud. Light comes from above, creating shadows around the eyes, the sides of the face, under his nose, mouth, and chin. Therefore, these areas become light in the negative image. Note that the hair falls straight to the shoulders. Christ was laying in the tomb, but now he is standing up. He told the disciples that he would rise again. Review of our miracles in countdown order. Miracle 5. Image. History's first photograph, 33 AD. Probably only 10% remains from the 1st century. Miracle 4. Blood is pristine and mostly still intact. Miracle 3. Reveals the objects and flowers of the crucifixion, 33 AD. These have now disappeared completely since 1931. Miracle 2. Enhanced images. And Miracle 1. The man in dimensions. These miracles have been found using advanced technology. Careful thought. A document unlike any other. We mentioned that the shroud is a physical document. So this document proves that this man lived. It describes what happened, documents that a payment was made, and it takes the gospel from just a story to real life. Careful thought. So if you were God, what would you do? The shroud will show a distinguished man that everyone will recognize. There are 2- and 3-dimensional images. There is blood from the top of the head to the bottom of the feet, and even skeletal features that prove that this is not an artwork. The document shows objects used in the torture and flowers used for mourning the man's death. The document has so much information on it that it proves the man's identity. The document cannot be forged by even scientifically advanced men. Proof that your man lived, died, and rose again. It means Christianity is true.